In September 1939, Hitler plunges Europe into the Second World War of the century. Within 2 years, most of Western Europe has collapsed in defeat. Only Winston Churchill and the British Empire stand alone and defiant in the face of overwhelming odds. On the other side of the world, the newly elected Australian Prime Minister Robert Menzies commits troops once again in support of the mother country.
We can't be beaten except by ourselves.
But for the first time in Australia's history, the enemy is on the doorstep. Japan has invaded China and now threatens to expand even further southwards. To secure the safety of Australia, the young and ambitious Menzies undertakes a mission to the very heart of the war, bringing him into direct conflict with the great man himself.
You have abandoned Singapore.
Let us keep our minds on victory.
He is completely out of control.
You need chiefs of staff who are willing to tell you when you are talking nonsense.
I'm quite prepared to be thrown out, but I'm damned if I'll have my powers as Prime Minister whittled away.
It would become a bitter conflict that would forge the Menzies of political legend and reshape the future of Australia. In suburban Melbourne, Menzies enjoys a brief respite from the pressures of office, filming his children with his new colour movie camera. It's a tranquility he knows cannot last.
He practiced on us because he needed to get a real idea of how to handle a camera.
There's a smile here. Lovely.
He was interested in art and he knew what a picture ought to look like. And the result is, I think they're extremely good films.
But Menzies' real focus is on the task ahead of him. A mission to London to secure the strategic safety of Australia from Japan.
I'm not in the habit of keeping a diary, but in 1941 I broke my rule and kept one. It will serve to make this narrative more vivid if I make some occasional references to it.
Menzies' diary and his unique home movies have provided us with an extraordinary legacy and a surprisingly personal insight into a crucial period in the history of Australia.
The whole business is distressing to my wife, Patty. With typical directness, she told me, if you feel you must go, go. But you will be out of office within 6 weeks of your return.
Menzies' political power base, the United Australia Party, is in deep trouble. Riddled with intrigue and personal animosity, it clings to power with an extremely fragile majority. As he begins his hazardous journey, Menzies is joined by Frederick Shedden, the head of the Defence Department. An expert on foreign policy, Shedden would become a close confidant of Menzies.
Churchill had given me an assurance that if Japan did invade Australia, then Britain would cut her losses in the Mediterranean and come to our aid. What I wanted to know was, what did cut her losses and come to our aid actually mean?
The first stop is Singapore, the primary focus of Menzies' concerns. Singapore is the British military centre in Southeast Asia and a garrison for over 15,000 Australian troops, the cornerstone of Australia's defence policy against Japanese expansion. But Singapore is a shock. Menzies soon realises it's anything but the impregnable fortress it claims to be.
Singapore had no capital ships or carriers and grossly inadequate air defence. Figuratively and perhaps literally, its guns pointed in the wrong direction. When I met the new Commander-in-Chief, Brooke Popham, I had much ado not to say Dr. Livingstone, I presume. He left me with a feeling that his instincts favour some heroic but futile last stand, rather than clear-cut planning, realism and science.
Menzies' visit to Singapore only serves to increase his concerns that Churchill may be prepared to sacrifice Australia's interests for the sake of the Empire.
Well, Australia's attitude towards Churchill were very much shaped by the experience of the First World War, and people differ in their assessment of how central he was to the disaster of Gallipoli, but certainly he was a very key figure. From the Australian perspective, he was seen as being one of the reasons that so many Australians died in the Gallipoli campaign.
The next stop on the way to Britain is North Africa. 50,000 Australian soldiers and their British counterparts have just beaten the Italians, giving the Allies their first major victory of the war. Menzies goes straight to the front line to congratulate his troops.
Great day driving around the camps, troops drawn up in many places, salutes, great precision. And only the old and bold cooks calling out, "How are you, Bob?" No man can contemplate the deeds of these heroes without forming a solemn determination to do all that he can to support them.
There is an immense pride in Australian hearts today, and you are the subject of it. You may go forward encouraged by the knowledge that you do not fight alone.
It's a moving thing to speak to thousands of young men, mere boys in the flower of their youth, many of whom will never see Australia again. War is an abomination, but its servants are a sight to see.
Little did Menzies know that within 2 months Churchill would send these same young men into one of the greatest disasters of the war.
5 months have passed since I spoke to the British nation on the broadcast.
In his Cairo hotel room, Menzies encounters an unwelcome reminder of the man he is about to confront in London.
Mussolini, the crafty, cold-blooded, black-hearted Italian who had thought to gain an empire on the cheap by stabbing fallen France in the back.
Churchill broadcasts to the pleasure of all, save myself.
Spurred on by lust of power and brute
I describe Winston as a menace who stirs up hatreds in a world already seething with them.
only to be hurled back ignominiously.
He saw Churchill as being a rogue elephant, somebody who'd first of all taken Britain into a war that was possibly going to lead to the destruction of the British Empire.
Menzies is not a man who's grown up interested in war. In that sense, he's very different from Churchill. You know, Churchill sees himself as coming from a family of warriors. Churchill's in there interested in war from the very beginning.
Six weeks after leaving Australia, Menzies' aircraft enters the German-dominated skies above the English Channel.
Approaching England, we fly low. There's a feeling of running the gauntlet, tension in the nerves. We will all be happy to arrive. Came in across North Devon, the dark woods, the myriad hedges. What a lovely place at any time.
Menzies is still of the generation that called England home. As he says, he was born in the days of Queen Victoria, when, you know, the sun never set on the British Empire, when there was maps that had all that pink on them.
Menzies was born in Jeparit, on the edge of the Wimmera, in country Victoria.
The family read quite a bit for entertainment in the evening. They didn't have that many books, but his father read Robbie Burns, they read from Dickens, they read the Bible. I always visualise them, you know, sitting under this great big Wimmera sky in this little weatherboard house. So there's a sense that there he's reading the stories of a place which fills his imagination. And I think that's really important for understanding the real imaginative power that the Empire has for him for the rest of his life.
Straight from the battlefront at Benghazi comes Mr. Menzies, arriving in England at the end of a 21,000-mile air journey from Australia.
People of this country must very frequently be tempted to feel that they have the world against them. And I want to tell them that they are not alone, but because we are what some people occasionally forget, an integral portion of the British community in the world.
People respond to him very positively, very warmly. They applaud him. And so it's a wonderful confirmation that there he's been out there, the outer edges of empire. And when he gets to the centre, he's recognised as having, in a sense, many of the attributes that the people of the centre value. And I think that's enormously pleasurable and affirming for him.
Menzies is a personification of that staunch and stalwart spirit of our Australian kinsmen, so characteristically shown in the Empire's time of supreme peril.
A favourable press would be an increasingly important feature of Menzies' time in London, a stark contrast to his press coverage back home.
Menzies had enjoyed a very rapid rise to the top. He hadn't had to build the alliances and do the sort of political work that often less able people need to do to win political power.
After a dazzling rise through the law and state politics, Menzies became Attorney General under the popular Prime Minister, Joseph Lyons.
We live in troubled times.
But Menzies had always been seen as very ambitious. He wasn't a particularly popular choice when he became Prime Minister after Lyons' death. It was just that he was immensely able.
Now, 2 days after his arrival in England, Menzies is about to meet the one man who can make or break his mission. And his faith in the British Empire will be sorely tested.
To Chequers for the weekend, the house is closely guarded with sentries in every direction. My High Commissioner had warned me that I was likely to get a cordial welcome from Churchill, but if I try to pin him down, he is likely to be elusive.
Menzies can't resist using his camera to document life at Chequers.
I meet Mrs. Churchill, who is in good form, but she irritates Winston a little, as no doubt most people do.
It was 6 years since Churchill and Menzies had first met.
What would you like to drink? I'm having a brandy.
Back then, Churchill had been an isolated voice against the policy of appeasing Hitler's expansion in Europe. But now he is very much in his element and relishing every minute of it.
We have no doubt of our ability to destroy or cripple Hitler's armada.
Thank you.
So now we feel free to wage war in the Middle East.
Churchill wants to open another front in Greece. It would become an obsession that would frustrate Menzies' efforts to focus the British on the defence of Singapore.
It's quite clear that supporting Greece must have priority after Egypt has been made secure.
What a tempestuous creature he is, oratorical even in conversation, master of the mordant phrase, and yet almost without any real humour.
Hitler's about to intervene on a large scale in the Balkans.
We have a momentous discussion on the defence of Greece with Australian and New Zealand troops. It seems that Winston has already made up his mind, a decision which may mean the loss of thousands of lives.
Well, the Greek campaign is a very controversial campaign, and at the time it was seen as yet another example of Winston Churchill being willing irresponsibly to commit Dominion troops to an impossible exercise.
If there's any chance at all of forming a Balkan front, we must seize it.
Churchill felt that even if they failed, the political benefits of having made the effort would be quite significant. Virtually nobody seems to have been confident about the chances of success in Greece, but they continued with it regardless.
What Churchill hadn't told Menzies was that earlier that very day, the Greek government had accepted Britain's offer of support. Australian soldiers in North Africa were already being prepared for mobilisation to Greece. 2 days later, still unsettled by Churchill's single-minded obsession for the Greek campaign, Menzies arrives at Downing Street for his first War Cabinet meeting.
Gentlemen, we have the honour of being responsible for our country at a time of deadly danger and bad news. We will proceed with the business.
The agenda was not to include Singapore. Instead, Churchill pushes on with his plans for the defence of Greece.
Now, if Greece, with British aid, could hold up the German advance for some months, the chance of Turkish intervention will be favoured. Anyone?
The whole matter is discussed in 3/4 of an hour and would have finished in 10 minutes, but for some queries raised by me.
And what happens if the whole thing is a failure?
I was the only one to put questions. I feel like a new boy who in the first week of school commits the solecism of speaking to the captain.
All those in favour, subject to Menzies getting the agreement of his colleagues in Australia? Aye. Thank you, everyone.
Does this denote great clarity of mind in all these ministers? Or has Winston taken complete charge of them?
Menzies was appalled by the readiness with which Churchill could make decisions, life and death decisions about other people. It would have been a very brave Prime Minister to have been able to stand up not only to Churchill but to the whole cabinet and the whole military establishment of Britain.
Menzies soon finds he is not alone in his concerns over Churchill's autocratic leadership style. Later the same day, he is invited to dine with the royal family.
The Queen's first comment was, "Don't you think that this fellow Hitler's the most dreadful bore?" She has the shrewdest estimate of all the cabinet too, including Winston, whose weakness for yes-men she regrets.
Despite his reservations, Menzies is soon swept up in Churchill's popularity with the British public.
Mr. Churchill and his party went on a tour of the city's ruins. Mr. Menzies took home movies of the Prime Minister. To several people, the Premier said, "We shall give it them back."
What tragedies of lost or ruined lives must lie behind these scattered bricks? The hardest thing is to decide policies which, even if successful, must bring the angel of death into many of these homes. The successful leader is one who ignores the individual and thinks and acts in broad terms.
Menzies is determined to avoid the same fate for Australia. In desperation, he pleads with the British to take a tougher stand against Japanese expansion.
The absence of naval craft can only encourage the Japanese...
He meets with Alexander Cadogan, the permanent Under-Secretary for Foreign Affairs, and Rab Butler, the Parliamentary Secretary.
Now, if Japan is to take over Thailand and move down the Malay Peninsula, we should push forward to a point already selected, even if it does mean a breach of neutrality. The peg must be driven in somewhere. Firmness and friendliness are not incompatible.
We have no intention of provoking Japan. A war in the Far East without American involvement would have disastrous consequences.
Precisely, and that's a position Australia might find itself in very shortly. We have to put on a show of strength now.
Butler and Cadogan fail to impress that they know any more than we do. Frankly, drift seems policy of Foreign Office.
Goodbye.
Menzies leaves the meeting with a mounting sense of frustration at the indifference to the threat facing Australia.
What irresponsible rubbish these Antipodeans talk.
In early March, the Greek campaign begins. 50,000 British, Australian and New Zealand soldiers land and prepare to support the Greek army against German troops massing on the northern border. In Australia, Menzies' absence, now nearing the end of its second month, is threatening to further undermine his political position. Patty Menzies, aware of the intrigues against her husband from within his own party, cables her husband, imploring him to return home.
Father and I think it desirable. Immediate announcement of probable early return. Stop. Patty. Thank you, Diane.
He probably wasn't quite aware of how bad things were turning for him back in Australia. His wife, Patty Menzies, was, trying to get the message through to him, come back, there's backbiting, there's intrigue. But all of that would have seemed small and petty. This is England's darkest hour. The focus is on stopping the German invasion of Great Britain, if you like.
Menzies knows major decisions are being made in London affecting Australia's future. Despite Patty's concerns, he decides to stay.
Mr. Menzies recently paid a visit to Australians serving in the Coastal Command, somewhere in Britain. This energetic statement inspires everyone.
And I must say, for your commanding officer, he hasn't spoken to me about the war or the progress of international strategy, but he's talked to me about pay. No wonder they say all over the world, these Australians are terrific fellows. You've only got to pay them enough and they'll kill anybody.
Whilst Menzies is attracting a great deal of public admiration for his efforts in boosting British morale, he is increasingly concerned at Churchill's management of the home front. A trip to the naval dockyards leaves him shocked and alarmed at the lack of organisation and productivity.
Why do we persist in thinking that an admiral can run a dockyards? They are a shambles, like a second-hand machinery dealer's. Gave me the uneasy idea that repairing warships may be taking twice as long as it should.
With Nazi U-boats tightening the noose on Britain, Churchill calls an emergency meeting on the Battle of the Atlantic.
Now, the situation in the Atlantic is becoming dire. We have lost over 300 ships in the past 6 months. And we can't...
Ministers and service heads look and sound like sixth form boys in the presence of the headmaster. I wish I knew the secret. I make an attack on Admiralty control of industrial operations such as ship repairs.
Why don't you get some hard-faced chap from Yorkshire or the Midlands to come down and run the business as if it were his own, with drive and toughness?
You are laying your impious hands on the Ark of the Covenant. The naval system has existed since Nelson. Who are you to criticise it?
If Nelson were here, I'm sure he'd agree with me.
My father stood up to Churchill in the War Cabinet, and I think that was unusual. I think the others were fairly browbeaten, but he was, one of these rough colonials, and so maybe he could get away with more than the others.
Menzies' relationship with Churchill is clearly deteriorating. But his public appearances and rousing speeches are gaining attention.
Listen to this one, Bob. Menzies was sounded on the possibility of remaining in Britain indefinitely. They're saying on all sides, here is a man with an intellect to match Winston. Why can't we keep him here to continue in Cabinet?
He reads in the newspaper articles all these laudatory comments about himself, saying the most marvellous things about him, portraying Menzies as being second to Churchill, that if Churchill was to fall, Menzies was his natural successor.
While Churchill remains popular with the public, his position is not completely secure. There is another group, a political faction in the government and media, which has always been sceptical about Churchill's autocratic leadership style. Menzies' political life in London is about to enter a controversial period that historians still fiercely debate today.
There's no doubt that while Menzies was in London, he either approached or was approached by a number of people who were quite disaffected with Churchill's leadership.
Prominent amongst Churchill's critics is Nancy Astor, the wife of the owner of the Times newspaper and an ardent admirer of Menzies.
Lady Astor was very keen for him to stay there. She even offered him all her sapphires if he would stay in England. I think they just had great affection for my father, and they thought he could be useful in their country.
I mean, there were a whole load of people who were quite critical of Churchill. Lord and Lady Astor, Lord Beaverbrook was very critical of Churchill, and Lloyd George, of course, who'd been Prime Minister during the First World War. This man with war experience who was now sitting on the sidelines sniping at Churchill.
I think you could probably argue that Menzies was being used, courted, possibly even manipulated by those who wanted to be able to criticise Churchill.
Churchill's health was not all that good. I mean, he was a heavy drinker, a heavy smoker. He felt himself that he wouldn't survive the war. So there was a fear that even if he survived politically, he wouldn't survive physically.
In political circles, the topic of Churchill's leadership was increasingly debated. Since his arrival in London, Shedden had been meeting with an old friend and mentor, Sir Maurice Hankey, who was a member of the War Cabinet in the previous government, but had now been sidelined by Churchill.
He's deliberately smashed the system to increase his own power.
Maurice, from what I've seen, no one approaches Menzies as a successor to Churchill. I know this is a radical idea, but why shouldn't a Dominion Prime Minister lead the Empire in time of war?
Whether he ever realistically imagined he could become Prime Minister of England, I don't know. But I think, given the sort of man he was, there would have been a sense of the opening up of exciting possibilities if he were to stay.
During his visit to Manchester, Australia's Prime Minister can't resist going to Old Trafford to see how the Test cricket pitch looks. He has his cine camera with him to photograph the patch on the wicket caused by a bomb. The state of the pavilion leaves Mr. Menzies wondering if it was Hitler or Larwood who did it. It's a different kind of test this year. England and Australia team together, and they're both going to win.
In late March, just weeks after the start of the Greek campaign, the Allies' fortunes in North Africa take a dramatic turn for the worse. The German military genius, Rommel, launches a major counterattack that will change everything.
Things have gone wrong in Libya. Wavell's estimate of possible attack from Tripoli grossly falsified. We are in danger of inadequate retreat and grave loss.
Churchill is about to be sorely tested.
Our armoured brigade has been overrun by the Germans. The 7th Australian Division cannot now be sent to Greece, but will have to go to the Western Desert instead.
So we can't afford to reinforce Greece. It seems some of our generals constantly underestimate Germany's capacity.
If stout-hearted men with rifles cannot hold these people until the guns come up, I must revise my ideas of war.
Well, he should revise them quickly.
Tobruk must be held to the death with no thought of retirement.
Rommel's success in North Africa throws the controversial Greek campaign into jeopardy. Vital air cover has to be withdrawn from Greece and shifted to North Africa, leaving the Australians and other troops in Greece dangerously exposed. Backed by overwhelming air superiority, the German army sweeps through Greece, rapidly forcing the Allies southward. Meanwhile, the Allied position in North Africa has gone from bad to worse.
April 8th, Balkans bad. Generals O'Connor and Neame missing in Libya. The clouds are dark and there is a lurid patch in the sky. I hope not sunset. Come in. Thank you very much.
Back in Canberra, Acting Prime Minister Arthur Fadden is deeply alarmed at the news.
Dear Bob, If there should be defeat and evacuation in Greece, it could have severe effects on Japan's attitude to Australia.
Events are starting to close in on Menzies. He's increasingly anxious about Australian troops in North Africa and Greece, and afraid the lack of proper air support would be catastrophic if repeated in Singapore.
Fred, Lord Beaverbrook. Good.
Pleased to meet you.
Menzies turns to his friend and newspaper tycoon, Lord Beaverbrook. Now Minister for Air Supply, Beaverbrook is one of the most powerful men in Britain and another strong critic of Churchill.
The same situation in Singapore. If we are to prevent Japan from entering this war, we need planes, and we need them now. 3 squadrons of Hurricanes would send a very strong message to the Emperor.
I don't think what Menzies doesn't know is that Churchill had met with Beaverbrook the day before and ordered that no binding promises be made to Australia.
I understand your position, but it would be very difficult for us to convince the British people that we should release vital war assets when we are in the middle of a bitter campaign and your theatre has yet to begin.
Menzies finds himself increasingly torn between his allegiance to Australia and his concerns for the mother country.
The Times welcomes my remaining in London. I have mixed feelings. I'm desperately homesick. For sheer brutality, this kind of thing is beyond the imagining of those who have not actually witnessed it.
The bombing raids on the 16th and 17th of April were to be the most brutal and costly of the war. Over 2,000 Londoners were killed and 3,000 seriously injured.
A frightful scene. Street after street, furniture litters the footpaths. Poor old people, shocked and dazed, are led along to shelter. I am, in a grim sense, glad to have seen it.
Menzies' colour footage remains some of the most graphic film of the Blitz.
I'm all for peace when it comes, but it will be a tragedy for humanity if it comes before these beasts have had their own cities ravaged.
By mid-April, the German offensive in North Africa seems unstoppable. The Allied forces under General Wavell have retreated from Libya to Egypt. The port of Tobruk remains in Allied control, but under heavy siege. Meanwhile, German armour rumbles relentlessly towards British headquarters in Cairo. In Greece, the situation is now critical. The German Air Force mercilessly pounds Australian and New Zealand troops as they retreat southward. With the Allied Air Force severely depleted by the defence of North Africa, there are few planes remaining to cover retreat and evacuation.
We must divide between protecting evacuation and sustaining battle in Libya. Subject to above general remarks, victory in Libya comes first, evacuation of troops from Greece second, Iraq can be ignored, and Crete worked up later. Thank you.
Churchill's military strategy is in tatters.
The Greek position has deteriorated. Wavell has decided it's time to evacuate.
But I can't understand why you listened to him when he advised about the Greek campaign having any military merit.
What do you suggest I do about it? I inherited most of them.
You need chiefs of staff who are going to tell you when you're talking nonsense. The trouble is they're all in agreement with you. We desperately need air support to cover the evacuation. You're going to have to transfer some fighters from Cairo.
Cunningham's going to throw every vessel into the task. If we load them in at night, we should only lose 5,000 or so.
Winston is more addicted to wishful thinking every day. We will, in fact, lose at least 15,000.
Many of the men who were to be lost or captured were those same young soldiers Menzies had met in North Africa.
The Greek campaign was seen as a disaster in Australia. I mean, many Australians were not only killed but went into captivity. And when, of course, the threat that everyone had feared in Australia eventuates in late 1941 and early 1942, those troops are not available to come back and participate in the defence of Australia.
When news of the Greek debacle reaches Australia, it is seen as another black mark against Menzies. The Labour Party complains it hadn't been consulted on sending troops to Greece, and the Labour leader, John Curtin, is now being openly promoted as an alternative Prime Minister. Menzies' continued absence, now in its third month, is creating a leadership vacuum. Eager to shore up support at home, Menzies entertains a group of Australian journalists. One of them, Colin Bednall, records the details.
Can't all be jokes in the War Cabinet.
Well, to be perfectly honest with you, there's a shocking lack of guts and drive in the cabinet. You know, the meetings are just gatherings, you know, for Winston's pep talks. You know? They're all yes men, apart from Beaverbrook. You know? These days, stays in his office, gets on with his job.
You sure you want us to put this on record?
I think it would be a good idea if the people back home knew exactly how much I am needed here. What Winston really requires is a good lieutenant. You know?
Menzies didn't realise that the journalists' reports were being read by the censor and copies passed on to Churchill. The gloves are off. Menzies has overstepped the mark. The North African campaign is now a shambles. Unbeknownst to Churchill, General Staff have secretly prepared plans for the evacuation of Egypt. Churchill is furious. Menzies' quarrel with the British leader is about to reach a fateful climax.
What's next if Egypt falls? Is there a plan?
All plans for the evacuation of Egypt are to be rescinded. No surrenders will be tolerated unless there's at least 50% casualties. Our forces wouldn't wish to survive so shameful a defeat. There's also going to be no further reinforcement of Malaya and Singapore beyond those modest arrangements that are in progress. Thank you.
Winston. Winston. You have abandoned Singapore. Is it true you've also asked the US to move the Pacific Fleet to the Atlantic? I mean, where does that leave Australia? You make this momentous decision with no reference to me, and I'm right here in London.
Let us keep our minds on victory.
Churchill's priorities are with England. He has turned his back on the fate of Australia. For Menzies, one of the greatest empire men of his age, this is a most bitter pill to swallow. An official luncheon gives Menzies the chance to air his concerns with Maurice Hankey.
Sorry, have you got a moment? I need to talk to you about Churchill. He is completely out of control.
I agree entirely. I spoke with General Kennedy this morning. He said exactly the same thing. He's very anxious about it, said we would lose the war unless it was put right. Australia has a big stake in this war, and you're entitled to speak your mind. What you have to do is to make sure that Churchill uses his military and political advisors properly.
Well, Winston, we've been friends for quite a while. Doing a wonderful job running the country. The people have great faith in you. Wish I had half your popularity.
And?
Well, the problem is you're too damned autocratic. You have to start listening to your advisors. This whole disaster in the Middle East could have been avoided.
You've seen the people I'm surrounded with. On the big strategic issues, they have no ideas of their own, so I've got to do it myself. And anyway, I hear that you are much the same in Australia.
Oh, come on, Winston. It's not just my opinion. Other people are saying you're trying to do too much. A little less brilliance and a bit more balance is what I hear.
I'm quite prepared to be thrown out, but I'm damned if I'll have my powers as Prime Minister whittled away.
Menzies has outstayed his welcome. But he's not about to go without a fight. If he can lobby the other Commonwealth Prime Ministers, they could force Churchill into accepting him as a permanent member of the War Cabinet. He decides to visit North America on his way home. It gives him the opportunity to argue his case with Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King. King reserves judgment, but gives Menzies hope that he will argue the case with Churchill. "5 days after Menzies' departure from London, Lloyd George and others, emboldened by the failures in Greece and North Africa, forced Churchill to call a vote of confidence in his leadership. Churchill wins the vote, 447 to 3. After almost half a year's absence from Australia, Menzies heads home into a gathering storm, steeling himself for the hostile reception awaiting him.
I have a sick feeling of repugnance and apprehension that grows on me as I near Australia. I wish that I could creep quietly into the bosom of my family and rest there.
I come back to Australia with just one sick feeling in my heart, and that is that I must now come back to my own country and play politics. I think that it's a diabolical thing that anybody should have to come back and play politics, however cleanly, however friendlily, at a time like this.
Menzies always wanted elections and party politics suspended for the course of the war, so that there could be a united sort of bipartisan approach to the war. The Labor Party would never give him that. But there's a sense in which you can see him feeling, well, why am I having to worry about shoring up the numbers or worrying about party politics when there's such a grave threat facing the empire?
He thought that politics shouldn't intrude in wartime. You know, he had this naive view that politics somehow was put aside during wartime. Churchill, of course, was the consummate politician and knew that war was all about politics.
Heartened by his enthusiastic public reception, Menzies asks a colleague, "Where's this grave you say they've prepared for me?" He replies, "It's already dug. They're just waiting to push you in."
He didn't realise that being Prime Minister relied on the support of a whole lot of people who were far less able than he was, but they had a vote.
July 1941. Japan invades French Indochina. War in the Pacific seems inevitable. It is now even more crucial that Australia's voice be heard at Downing Street. With the imminent gathering of Commonwealth heads in London, Menzies knows this is his last opportunity to lobby for a place on the War Cabinet. But first, he must win the support of his parliamentary colleagues.
Given the even division of the House, I could only go to England as Prime Minister if the Labour Party agreed. John Curtin was prepared to have a look at this, but his colleagues differed.
Relegated to the sidelines, Menzies must now wait with ill-concealed frustration while his Commonwealth counterparts gather in London.
Menzies hoped to put pressure on Churchill, but Churchill simply refused. He effectively thwarted Menzies' scheme.
Menzies has played his last hand and failed.
I called a meeting of the Cabinet and invited my colleagues to speak their mind on my leadership. Within half an hour I had my answer. There was a strong view that my unpopularity was a threat to the survival of the government, and a change in leadership was called for. When the blow fell, it was like the stroke of doom. I had been weighed in the balance and found wanting. The whole thing reminded me of when I made the mistake of going to a bullfight in Portugal on the way home. The picadors tormented the bull with thrusts of their lances until it was weak with exhaustion. Only then did the matador come out for the kill. I feel like that bull. I think I'll lie down and bleed a while.
Menzies is in political limbo. No longer a powerful player on the world stage, he now finds himself an obscure figure on the backbench. Churchill sends him a message of condolence, alluding to his own failure over Gallipoli.
I went through a similar experience when I was removed from the Admiralty at the moment when I could have given the Anzacs a fair chance of success at the Dardanelles. It's always a comfort to feel sure one has done one's duty and one's best.
For the rest of the war, Churchill blocks each and every attempt by Menzies to return to London. In December 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, forcing the United States into the war. The fragile Conservative coalition that was the United Australia Party has collapsed and been replaced by a Labour government under John Curtin.
We feel that our fate and that of the United States of America are unbreakably linked. We know that our destinies will go forward hand in hand, and we are proud and confident in that association.
In February 1942, Menzies' worst fears are realised. Singapore falls to the Japanese. Over 130,000 troops are captured. 15,000 Australian soldiers spend the rest of the war in forced labour camps, where many meet their death. Consigned to the political wilderness, Menzies now finds ample time to contemplate his future. Menzies begins to focus on the mistakes of the past and create a new vision for the future. Although he often criticised Churchill for his arrogance and autocratic leadership, the same might equally apply to Menzies himself. But despite Churchill's failings, his undisputed strength lay in his connection to ordinary men and women, his ability to speak directly to them, in words they understood, and sentiments that touched their hearts.
That period on the backbench marks the break, I think, between the younger Menzies, who's too clever by half, and an older Menzies who's wiser and more mature and more considered in his political responses.
My fall from office enabled quite a few people to write my political obituary, but it had the opposite effect on me. I refused to accept defeat as permanent.
Using Churchill's example of speaking directly to the people, Menzies now begins a series of weekly radio broadcasts. One of them was to prove deeply significant and would change forever the political landscape of Australia.
Quite recently, a bishop wrote a letter to a great daily paper. He sought to divide the people of Australia into classes. But if we are to talk of classes, then the time has come to say something of the forgotten class, the middle class.
I see the Forgotten People speech as Menzies thinking hard about why to stay in politics. Who is it that he represents? He's holding up the home-centred, family-centred lives, which is the sort of life his parents lived and which was the sort of life actually many Australians lived, and saying, well, that's the sort of Australia we want, where people can be centred on their homes, bringing up their children in a peaceful world after the war.
I do not believe that the real life of this nation is to be found either in the great luxury hotels and petty gossip of so-called fashionable suburbs. It is to be found in the homes of people who are nameless and unadvertised, and who, whatever their religion, see in their children their greatest contribution to the immortality of their race.
One of the reasons the Forgotten People speech is so important is that it's the clearest articulation we've got of the absolutely central non-Labor belief that it's what a person is rather than what a person does that counts. That is, that it's a person's character, it's a person in their private realm that's really what's important to their politics rather than their role in the economy.
The individual and his encouragement is the prime motive force behind the building of a better world.
With the Conservative parties now in complete disarray, Menzies takes on the task of persuading the many right-of-centre factions to form a new entity with a single voice, the Liberal Party of Australia. When Germany finally surrenders, Winston Churchill is hailed as a conquering hero. Yet within 2 months of victory, he would be unceremoniously dumped as Prime Minister. In 1948, Menzies visits England and receives an unlikely invitation from his former adversary.
The old man looks no older, but has mellowed marvellously. Conversation is now a two-sided affair, vastly cheerful and informative.
The two veterans now discover they have much more in common than during those dark days in 1941. They reconcile their differences and begin what will become an enduring friendship. As they stroll together in the afternoon light, they discuss the spectre of a new enemy, Russia, and plot their own return to power.
5 million Australians turn out in light suits and summer dresses to choose their government for the next 3 years. Over in Melbourne, Mr. Menzies casts one certain vote for Mr. Menzies.
In 1949, Menzies and his Liberal Party are swept back into power. For the next 16 years, Menzies would preside over a period of unprecedented economic prosperity and stability that became synonymous with the man himself, the Menzies era. It would be an era dominated by the Cold War abroad and social conservatism at home. When Churchill dies in 1965, Menzies laments the loss of his close personal friend. The lessons he had learned from Churchill had helped to make him the international statesman he had now become. As world leaders gather to acknowledge Churchill, Menzies pays tribute to the man he once so resolutely opposed.
Winston Churchill was not an institution, but a man. Not a man who spoke to us from the mountaintops, but a man who expressed the simple and enduring feelings of ordinary men and women.
Neither Churchill nor Menzies were simple or ordinary. Both men had found their separate niche in history, one in war, the other in peace.